Tributes and condolences continue to pour in from Africa and the rest of the world following the death of former UN chief and Nobel Peace laureate Kofi Annan, who has been described in some quarters as diplomatic rock star. Annan, who died Saturday at the age of 80, led the United Nations the divisive years of the Iraq War and the trauma of the September 11th attacks, 2001 attacks. The first Secretary General from Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghanaian born Annan, was credited for raising the United Nations profile two-term tenure from January 1997 to December 2006. The charismatic, quiet-spoken career diplomat will be remembered as the United Nations Star Secretary General and arguably the world's most popular leader, but as peacekeeping chief of the UN's darkest chapters, the Rwandan genocide and the Bosnian war happened on his watch. Now, in Kofi Annan's birthplace, the former Gold Coast, Ghanaians have been sharing their views following the death of former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize, that is Kofi Annan, and remember his legacy, not only as a Ghanaian, but also as one of the most important African figures of the past decades. There was a pouring of condolences from leaders around the world. Current UN Chief Antonio Guterres voiced deep sadness at the news, describing his predecessor as a guiding force for good.
We are very proud of him, whatever he has achieved in life. And he has not only made Ghana proud, he has made Africa proud. And moreover, I can say he has made the world proud, and it's a sad moment for the world. I wouldn't limit him to Ghana.
If any war is coming to that country, he used to go and solve it. And solve it. If he talk, no mercy. Everything will be cool. He's a peaceful man.
You know, when a black man from Africa here who can occupy such posts, that means that guy is a famous guy, a strong man.
Of course, Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo declared a week of mourning, saying the national flag will fly at half-mast at home and in the country's diplomatic missions around the world in honor of, quote-unquote, one of our greatest compatriots. That is the statement there from Ghanaian President. In studio today, we have Tom Maliti, who's a veteran journalist and world affairs analyst. Tom, good to see you. Welcome to Bottom Line Africa once again. I understand that you've extensively covered the United Nations and, to be specific, Kofi Annan when he was at the helm of the UN. Perhaps can you tell us some of your highlights when he was at the top of UN?
Yusuf, thank you for having me on your program. I have covered the UN principally because important UN programs or agencies that are headquartered in Nairobi, that is UN Habitat and the United Nations Environment Program. And I did interact with Kofi Annan during the peace talks or the talks that led to the formation of the Grand Coalition government in 2008 after the post-election violence of the election of December 2007.
Yes.
What I can say about Kofi Annan is that one of his failures as a diplomat or as a UN official was not pushing hard enough to deal with the Rwanda genocide that was happening under his watch when he was in the UN peacekeeping office.
Yes.
I think at that time he was the head of the UN peacekeeping office and received a memo from the UN commander on the ground, General Canada, saying that they have they have identified a place where there are weapons that may be used in a genocide that may happen weeks to come. So they had warning weeks in advance of the genocide, and he, as well as the upper hierarchy of the United Nations, failed to act on that. I think one of his high points as a diplomat, not at the UN but outside the UN, was stemming the violence that had flared up in Kenya in January 2008, February 2008. So in that sense, Africa was central to him, A, because he's an African, but also in terms of both his failures and his successes.
And of course, after the Rwandan genocide, this is what he had to say. He said that, that event shaped his global thinking. And of course, he gave out some regrets. He talked about, the UN could have even done more at the moment. And it seems after even leaving the United Nations, he was still very much key in brokering peace in Africa, to be specific, Kenya and Zimbabwe.
But not just even Kenya and Zimbabwe. He even tried in Syria. He was called to lead a mediation process in Syria. And after working there for about a year, I think, he looked and said and realized that the different sides were too intransigent. So he resigned and said, look, this is difficult. Nobody's willing, people are not willing to actually negotiate. They may come to the negotiating table, but they're not willing to negotiate.
So there's a big blow basically for Africa, right? His death.
This is a significant loss for Africa because we have lost an institution, given the fact that he was the first individual who had risen through the ranks of the United Nations to become the United Nations Secretary General. No other individual has done that. Past UN Secretary Generals and the current one have all been diplomats from their nations or served as cabinet ministers in their nations before becoming UN Secretary General. So in that sense, his knowledge of the UN system, but also his knowledge of diplomacy across the world for Africa is a great loss. And
this is a man who has been referred to as a rock star diplomat, as already read out in the intro before. Why do you think he stood out from the rest of the other, United Nations top bosses?
I think one thing is that he was constantly learning on the job, using his experience to implement what he had learned. So for instance, referring to the Rwanda genocide, the UN failed there. Also the world generally failed Rwanda. And then when the Iraq war came up, he took a position where he criticized the big powers who were engaged in the Iraq war and took them on as the United Nations Secretary General, which was significant. So he had learned the lesson of Rwanda, that to allow bureaucracy, to allow diplomacy, behind-the-scenes diplomacy to take its time may not be as effective as, using the pulpit of the UN to at least raise a flag.
And there's something, with most African leaders, especially those who've succeeded in the private sector or the United Nations, they always come home and show interest in politics. But with Kofi Annan, we've never seen him show any interest with politics in Ghana. I mean, does that show you the character of this individual?
I think he felt that his role was different, and in that sense,
a real diplomat.
in that he was different from maybe other African leaders who have served in international organizations and feel that they have a role to play back home. I think he felt that his role was a global role. So not only once he left the United Nations, his role globally did not cease. He was a member of the Elders. This is a group that was founded by Nelson Mandela, of former heads of state. So for instance, former US President Jimmy Carter, former President of Ireland Mary Robinson, as well as people like, I think, Desmond Tutu. And the idea of the Elders was individuals who had made an impact on the global stage or who had some measure of influence, who could, in times of crisis, go somewhere and try and appeal to the common good and have people sort of bring down tensions and stabilize a situation.
Yeah, from your explanation, clearly this is a man who has done a lot of positive things for not just Africa but across the world. So don't you think critics out there perhaps harshly criticizing him for, to be specific, the Rwandan genocide once again and the Bosnian War?
I think the criticism is justified. It's just that it's focused on one man. I think the criticism of the genocide is that the world, if one is to talk about Africa, the Organization of African Unity as it was then, failed Rwanda. There were warning signs and people allowed their partisan, selfish interests to dominate rather than the common good of the Rwandan people to dominate and effectively deal with the Rwandan genocide.
Many thanks, Tom, for your input. Tom Maliti there, veteran journalist and world affairs. And before we cross over to yet another story item, it's